Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Today we are starting a program. We are doing a program that is very dear to my heart. We will talk about a very important topic that is Catholic modernism. It's very important and very influential. You know, there is a lot of people that like to talk about the danger coming from Vatican II and blah, 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 but they do not understand that most of the danger that they see as starting from Vatican II indeed are probably starting some decades later. And modernism is certainly the period where you have to look. Of course, there are different opinions about modernism. There are people that like it very much and they see it as something beneficial to the Catholic Church reform. And there are some other people, including the one that is speaking, that see modernism as something very dangerous. But of course, we will talk about this with some guests that I'm going to introduce and that have certainly different opinion about modernism. So we will see respectfully what are the different opinions, and we will try to make a nice debate without being too harsh with one another. So I start to introduce my guest, starting from my left for you that see. So we have theologian Deacon Stephen Morgan, that is from UK, but now is living and working in Macau. So thank you, Deacon Stephen, for your participation, your first participation in our streaming. Then we have Father David Schultenhofer, that is a Jesuit from United States and is a historical theologian. So thank you, Father Schultenhofer, for your participation. And then we have a recurring guest, as say for the TV series. We have Sebastian Morello, that is a philosopher from UK that will soon go to United States to teach in Princeton University. So thank you, Sebastian, for returning here, and it's always a pleasure. And then we have Father Charles Taylor, that is a theologian from United States. And Father Taylor, as indeed all the other guests, also write meaningful books and articles about the very topic that we are going to speak today, that is modernism. So thank you, Father, for your participation. So modernism is a very complicated topic, and I want to start, and I ask you to have a little patience for my pronunciation, to quote from one of the, or no one, I would say the most important document about modernism, that is the Encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis by Pope Pius X, Saint Pius X. The document was published with the date of September 8, 1907, even if it was released 1 week later. And I want to read with you a few lines, and then I want to comment. I think you can see the document, so even if my pronunciation is not so good, but you can read it. So I start to read. It may be, venerable brethren, that some may think we have dwelt too long on this exposition of the doctrines of the modernists, but it was necessary, both in order to refute their customary charge that we do not understand their ideas, and to show that their system does not consist in scattered and unconnected theories, but in a perfectly organized body, all the parts of which are solidly joined, so that it is not possible to admit one without admitting all. For this reason, too, we have had to give this exposition a somewhat didactic form, and not to shrink from employing certain uncouth terms in use among the modernists. And now, can anybody who takes a survey of the whole system be surprised that we should define it as the synthesis of all heresies? Were one to attempt the task of collecting together all the errors that have been broached against the faith and to concentrate the sap and substance of them all into one, he could not better succeed than the modernists have done. Nay, they have done more than this. For, as we have already intimated, their system means the destruction not of the Catholic religion alone, but of all religion. With good reason do the rationalists applaud them, for the most sincere and the frankest among the rationalists warmly welcome the modernists as their most valuable allies. Now, of course, what was said by Pope Pius X is quite clear. So I want to start with Father Schultenhofer. Father Schultenhofer, we know that in those years when Pope Pius X focused on the modernism, one of the names that most was on the we may say on the press was Tyrel, the Jesuit that then leave the Jesuits that you have studied in the past, and for what you were considered the foremost expert in Tyrel. He was Irish, if I remember correctly, and there is the autobiography in 2 volumes that I read and that really present the struggle of this man. And personally, I have always the impression, reading his writings, that he should never be a Jesuit on the first place, because his spirit was totally against what was, and he always had problems with the Jesuit. Maybe can you tell me if I'm wrong or not? The microphone, please unmute your microphone. Yes.
Thank you. You are not entirely wrong, but I would say that Tyrel had a vocation to the Society of Jesus as he understood it, and I think he understood it better from his study of Saint Ignatius and his writings about Saint Ignatius, some of which he destroyed because he found that he did not have a whole lot of sympathy among his peers in the Society of Jesus. But yet, if Tyrel had been born in the age in which I was born, he probably would never have been dismissed from the Society of Jesus. And in fact, even during his day, the general of the society at the time probably would not himself have dismissed Tyrel, but he was virtually forced to by Pope Pius X to dismiss Tyrel. Tyrel was born in a time when the 19th century is an incredibly complex period in terms of the history that was going on and the development of doctrine that was happening, the development of theological, historical, critical thought that he got involved in, and found it very congenial to himself. For him, it made a whole lot of sense. In fact, he was very much influenced by Schleiermacher, although you don't find that directly in his writings, but indirectly, because of the theologians and philosophers that Schleiermacher had influenced, that in turn had influenced Friedrich von Hugel, who was a great mind and a great friend of George Tyrel. And in fact, von Hugel rather tutored Tyrel in the authors that he should read in order to bring himself into conversation with all that was going on in the 19th century and into the 20th century, which Tyrel did. So he was much in advance of many of his Jesuit companions at the time. But as time went on and Vatican II eventually happened, we can see from the documents of Vatican II, I have argued that Tyrel was one of the principal influence, had great influence on the documents of Vatican II through the men who were there at the council, who considered Pariti and who actually wrote most of the documents. So it was Vatican II actually that influenced me to move out of the discipline that I was working in at the time. I was about a year away from completing a doctorate in organic chemistry when I read the documents of Vatican II. And I said, this makes more sense to me than anything else that I have read up to this time. And so when I was in my theological studies and working on a PhD then in historical theology, it was Tyrel that I decided to do my research on, and I did. And so
yes, and now you are also I don't remember if you have just completed the biography of the Jesuit general father that was the one that had to deal with Tyrel, Father Luis Garcia. So you already published this book, or? Yes.
It's the Superior General.
The Superior General, yes.
Yes, Luis Martin Garcia.
Yes.
He was the one who dismissed Tyrel from the society.
And your book is already published?
It is published from Brill.
It is published. Okay, yes. So it will be a good reading for people that want to know more about the functioning of the Society of Jesus at the time of Tyrel. And I want to go to Father Taylor. And Father, we discuss about now one of the main protagonist of the modernism, that is Tyrel. I know that you are also expert about another important protagonist, that is the French biblical scholar Alfred Loisy. But now I want you to give for everyone a very short introduction to what is modernism. So when we talk about modernism, what the people should understand with this term?
Okay, thank you. Modernism can be considered a set of loosely coordinated tendencies more than a consciously organized movement that had some degree of organization, rather loose, but it was not a concerted series of interlinked and orchestrated efforts on the part of modernists themselves. They worked in various areas. Some of their concerns overlapped, and collectively, certainly they were perceived as a kind of force that imperiled Catholicism, as your reading from Pascendi set forth. So modernism, kind of succinctly, has a kind of intellectual side and a sort of social side. And depending on what region of the church one is looking at, either one of those sides tends to be a bit more prominent. On the intellectual side, modernism is concerned with the so-called apologetic question. And the apologetic question is very often identified with the philosopher, the lay philosopher, Maurice Blondel. And Blondel was concerned that if one is going to present the faith to minds formed by modernity, you sort of had to start from where people actually thought. And so one of his points was you shouldn't have to become a scholastic in order to become a Catholic. Now, he understood that that doesn't necessarily say that Thomas Aquinas is passé, but it's simply that you sort of have to start from the experiential basis of people and bring them to a point where, in a sense, Aquinas could make sense to them. In a larger kind of framework, there were other people that got involved in philosophy who were much more radical than Maurice Blondel. Marcel Hebert, for example, who unfortunately not only leaves the priesthood, but leaves the church and loses his faith. A second major area in intellectual modernism is the so-called biblical question. And Alfred Loisy is sort of the central identifying figure for the biblical question. And this is really what one is to do with historical biblical criticism. It had come into the church largely through Protestant or rationalist kind of circles. And Loisy didn't start out to leave the church, to become a so-called modernist. Loisy started out with the conviction that one would be able to domesticate historical critical method and to use it in service of Catholicism, to defend it against rationalists or defend it against a kind of Protestant criticism. Unfortunately, one can say, and here we go back to Pascendi, that the philosophical underpinnings of the use of his method did not do him great service. And unfortunately, while Loisy says some things that are worth considering, nonetheless, the thrust, if you will, of his overall thought led him outside the church. So one would not say that if Loisy had lived at the time of Vatican II, given what he said, that again, he would have been simply ahead of his time. What had happened with historical critical method, of course, is that the philosophical underpinnings were not tied to those that were utilized by Loisy and several others at the time. And it was possible to keep a closer connection between biblical criticism and theology. And the person for that would be Marie-Joseph Lagrange of the École Biblique. Lagrange is regarded with some suspicion for his use of biblical criticism, but he remains with the church and again succeeds in bringing biblical criticism, as you might say, into the kind of frame that Loisy originally envisioned, but wasn't able to bring about. Thirdly, there's the so-called dogmatic question. And in a certain sense, once your philosophical kinds of infrastructure begins to change to a more modern kind of dialogue, and once again, you take account of biblical critical method, the way that you approach doctrine and dogma undergoes a certain change. And to their credit, the modernists realized that dogma has a practical aspect. And they were afraid that the conceptualization of dogma in scholastic terms left people with too little purchase on how that was practically effective in their lives. Social modernism is something that essentially looks at how the church relates to democracy. And democracy was a traumatic, largely, experience for the church, given the French Revolution. And so I've heard modernism described as one of the aftershocks of the French Revolution. And again, I think you could make a case for that. So in certain parts of the church, intellectual modernism, much more paramount. In other parts, social modern, and I think Italy would be a place where social modernism was more.
Yeah, of course, we have Romolo Murri,
yes,
that was one of the foremost modernists, even if he doesn't like to be called as such as a modernist, but he was at the root of the Democrazia Cristiana, Christian democracy. I don't know, that is a political party that ran Italy for many decades, basically. So it was very important. But also, I want to remind our viewers that Father Taylor mentioned before Lagrange, the Dominican Lagrange. And of course, is another Lagrange respect, Garrigou Lagrange, that will come a little later, and that was a great theologian, Thomistic theologian, one considered as the as the greatest theologian among the Thomistic school. And I want to now have a question for Sebastian, and but with in view Deacon Morgan, because I want to speak later with Deacon Morgan about Newman, because Newman has also something to do with the modernism, even if not directly, but some people envision him as like an inspiration, so that maybe he will explain to us. But I want to go first to Sebastian and ask, Father Taylor has spoken about the philosophical side of modernism. Do you have anything to add on this aspect? We have spoken about Blondel, of course, but there are many others that were very influential. So do you have anything to add to what Father Taylor has said?
Well, I thought what Father Taylor said was extremely helpful and covered a great deal. And I think he's right. If you want to really understand modernism, you have to engage with the fundamental, especially epistemological commitments of people working during that time. So, and of course, Pius X links modernism directly to rationalism. And rationalism is, if you want to put it as briefly as possible, rationalism is the prioritizing of ideas over things. And most people loosely date rationalism back to the turn to the self, the epistemological turn in Descartes. But the person who really puts this into, or attempts to put this into an exhaustive philosophy is Immanuel Kant, who wants to argue that there are limits to reason, and he wants to demonstrate what the limits of reason are. And he does that in such a way as to envelop reason and in a sense cut off knowledge that can be procured through some kind of religious revelation. And what this means is that religious revelation ultimately becomes consigned to the arena of something at least akin to superstition. It's not where rational, serious deliberation takes place. Now, this actually had certain advantages to it in a strange way. People, therefore, in the 18th century, threw themselves into the natural world, not only in a scientific way, but also in a romantic way. And, people like in this country, you had people like Wordsworth and Coleridge going off to Germany and studying German romanticism, and then coming back and taking up arguments for Christianity in a new way. The church ended up enjoying enormous dividends from the Romantic movement, of which, in part, of course, Newman was a product. Now, the problem with all of this, though, is that you get this rise of naturalism and rationalism in the church as deliberation cut off from the supernatural is where serious thinking takes place. And as Father Taylor said, this had consequences in the reading of Scripture and the rise of the historical critical method. But it also, it meant that things like miracles and the whole life of supernature was called into question. And I expect we'll come onto this a little bit later, but one of the great consequences of this in the 20th century was that, for example, the Second Vatican Council framed itself largely as a turning of the church toward the natural arena, toward the world, as it said, and gave the world a kind of didactic position for the church. And the church was largely meant to sit at its feet and learn. And then when this manifested itself in liturgical innovations, For example, one of the first things that Archbishop Bunini did is he excluded nearly all of the references to grace in the liturgy. Well, this is all part of trying to get rid of things that after the rise of naturalism and rationalism are frankly just embarrassing to mention these things. And then if you want to try and explain many of the somewhat mystifying allocutions of our current Holy Father on the moral life, for example, understanding the moral life and conscience and its imperatives independently from what grace can bestow onto and into nature, then you've got to look at these prior epistemological commitments from which modernism arose. And I suppose I would just, a final point on the philosophical side of things that you might want to add to this, is that in this sense, you can understand why Pius X wanted to frame modernism as the synthesis of all errors, because whereas perhaps all previous errors called some aspect of the supernatural life into question, what modernism seemed to do was call supernature per se into question, and in turn sweep the rug from under the feet of the whole Christian project. So that's one way of understanding that formulation as of modernism as the synthesis of all errors. I'll leave it there and let you talk to Deacon Stephen.
Thank you very much. And I want to talk with Deacon Stephen about one issue that I'm sure is very dear to him, that concern one of the people that usually is often is often mentioned when talking about the inspiration of modernism. There are two. One is Antonio Rosmini, also that I also like for other things, and the other one is John Henry Newman. So I want to show to Deacon Morgan this book that I'm not sure if he's aware, and that is a book that is called Cardinal Newman, Trojan Horse in the Church, by Father Paul Kimball, that is St. Pius X father. And he say in the description, Cardinal Newman's theory of the development of doctrine, along with the other ideas that were controversial during his time, and herein analyzed by renowned theologians and an equally literal Catholic, Hortensius Bronson. On the other hand, Newman's famous biographer Wilfrid Ward made the cardinal an untouchable anti-liberal to traditionally minded Catholics, yet an avant-garde liberal pioneer to liberal Catholics, including the very founders of the school of modernism. Even if it can be argued that Newman acted in good faith, what is not generally known is that he formed his own school of thought within the Church, favoring a mutability of Catholic doctrine, seemingly adopted and acclaimed by the Second Vatican Council. So I don't know if you know this book, but I want to know what you make of this, and what you can say when some people argue that Newman is one of the inspiration for the modernist school. Remember the microphone, to unmute the microphone so that we can hear what you say. Thank you. The microphone, the microphone. You have to unmute. Yes.
Yeah. I think it's unmuted. Maybe it's taking a long time to get to you from China. Yes, I'm familiar with the book. I think one of the things I would say is that if you try to read Newman, having made an assumption about what he thinks before you start reading him, you're going to end up with the kind of conclusion that you've just read out. That's certainly what Orestes Brownson did. and it seems to me that that's what's going on in the Trojan Horse book. Even Pius X explicitly said that he didn't think Newman was a modernist in his correspondence with the Bishop of Limerick in 1908. Interestingly, Tyrel didn't think that Newman was a modernist either, but he did think that modernism was a progeny of Newman's. I think that's fair to say. The issue where Newman is concerned is that he was a man who was acutely aware of the subjective turn, which Sebastian's just talked about. He was also acutely aware of historical consciousness, and he rather agonized about the fact that dogma, which should be immutable, seemed to have changed in its expression, and he needed to come up with an explanation for that. He refers to it as a hypothesis. His solution is a hypothesis to account for that difficulty, and that's not simply a turn of phrase he came up with in 1845 when he'd lost faith in the church of his baptism. It was something that he had toyed with for 20 years. He preached a sermon in 1826 in which he called the change in the expression of doctrine a difficulty in search of a hypothesis. If you're operating in a world which has developed historical consciousness, if you're operating in a world where there is an acute awareness of the human subject and a developing awareness of the human subject, taking refuge in the categories of an almost entirely objectivist scholasticism, as he experienced in Rome, isn't actually going to help you. It isn't going to allow you to present the faith in a manner that is convincing to a society that is thinking in historical and subjectivist terms. So on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, you have Newman's absolutely firm conviction that the articles of faith are facts, not opinions, and that, in fact, he says he knows no other religion but the dogmatic, and has a profound opposition to what he calls the theory of liberalism in religion, which he then describes as the anti-dogmatic principle. He's committed to the notion, right from his first conversion in 1816 as a teenager, that Christianity is dogmatic, and that dogma has been committed to the church. It's been committed to the church in a manner that relies upon divine revelation, but it needs to be communicated in a society that's become aware of changes. So I think it's unfair to suggest that he's a Trojan horse of modernism. I don't think he's that at all, and I think the intemperate language in that book actually indicates a failure to read Newman in his own terms. We've got to be clear. Neo-scholasticism is not Catholicism. They're not identities. That isn't to say that neo-scholasticism or scholasticism or any other system of thinking can't be used, and we know that the perennial philosophy of St. Thomas is of lasting value for the church. The church has confirmed that often enough, including in the current Code of Canon Law. But nonetheless, it isn't Catholicism. It's a philosophical system that allows us to express Catholicism in a manner that is more or less satisfactory. Where it comes up short for Newman is where it comes up short for modern man. And he was attempting, certainly in the essay on development, to offer a hypothesis to account for a difficulty. He, by the way, gets rather bored with the process about 2/3 of the way through writing the book, which is why the latter 4 tests that he calls them tests originally, he later calls them notes. The latter 4 tests have become quite short because he's convinced himself that the answer to the question of how you account for change in the face of the reality of dogmatic continuity is simply by the teaching authority of the church. So I think whilst it's fair to say that some people can run with Newman and end up modernists, it's neither inevitable, nor do I think, given Newman's own commitment to dogmatic religion, nor do I think it's fair.
Thank you. And I want to say that despite what I say, indeed, we are going already live because I made a little mistake, but there is no problem because in any case, you will not able to retract any of the things you have said before, but I'm sure you have not to be ashamed of anything you have said until now. I want to remember our viewers that few things. First of all, next week we have a program in Italian about the composer of sacred music Lorenzo Perosi. If you understand Italian, it's Thursday. Musica sacra a cavallo di due secoli, sacred music between two centuries. So if you don't understand Italian and you only rely on your English, there is something good for you on Friday. Like today, we have a program on synodality, a new way for the church, where we have guests Father Francesco Giordano, José Antonio Ureta, Jules Gomez, Eduardo Echevarria, that is an American professor, and of course with myself. So if you can, or Thursday or Friday, we have two programs. Then I want to show you a few things before we go on. First of all, I want to show you that we are live on Ritorno a Itaca, my Twitter, Aurelio Porfiri, my fan page, Aurelio Porfiri in Facebook. If you want to know and be updated about everything I'm doing, go to Telegram and look for Aurelio Porfiri's channel, and you will be updated together with other people of everything I'm doing. Also, I want to, because we are talking about modernism, I want to show you my book on Michael Davis, A Future in Tradition, Remembering Michael Davis, and is available on Amazon and on other shops. And this book, there is also an interview that was never published that I did with Michael Davis at the beginning of the 21st century, and that he's here published for the first time, A Future in Tradition. Then I want to show you a book that I wrote together with the Vaticanist, foremost Vaticanist Aldo Maria Valli. The book is called Uprooted, Dialogues on the Liquid Church, also available in different formats on Amazon and on other stores. Then we have my history, a short history of Catholic sacred music, Forever I Will Sing, with the preface of Cardinal Raymond Leo Burke. That is also available, and also available in Chinese, and was published by the Catholic Center of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So if you read Chinese, you can read it also. Sorry, there are two more books that are not yet released, but that will be very important, where I have something to do. This one is the Catholic Mass, Ways to Reestablish God at the Center of Liturgy, by Bishop Athanasius Schneider, and co-authored by myself, and it will be available from January in United States first, but it is already available for pre-order in Amazon, so you can pre-order this book by Bishop Schneider, co-authored by myself, the Catholic Mass. And last but not least, we have the autobiography of Cardinal Joseph Zen, God Has Never Abandoned Me, My Life in the Chinese Catholic Church, also co-authored by yours truly. And this book also is available for pre-order and will be finally available on the first months of 2022. in all books. Also will be published in United States first. So sorry for this long promotion, but it is a way to make people known about these books. So I want to go to Father Schultenhofer. Father, I have a question that is maybe a little provocative, but I hope you will not be you will not take it personal. Then I will go to Sebastian for Newman, but I want first to go to Father Schultenhofer and say this. When you read about modernism, okay, one thing's always strike your attention. I read a lot of books about modernism. I read a lot of books from modernists. And one of the things that always recur is that the modernists hate Jesuits. Because Jesuits were, the most important defensor of orthodoxy, and also one of the first to use the word modernist, as you surely know, was Father Matteo Liberatore in Civiltà Cattolica in the end of the 19th century. One of the first, not the first, but one of the first. So all conservative, all progressive Catholics hate modernists. Now, if you read hate Jesuits. So now, if you read the writings of conservative Catholics, you will find that they most of all hate Jesuits. So what happened in the meantime? What is the virus that you get in the meantime that changed so much the perception of the Jesuits from the most important defensor of orthodoxy to the biggest danger to orthodoxy for some Catholics? So can you let me understand what happened in the meantime?
Oh, sure. Give me a minute. I'll fix that.
Okay, thank you.
Wow, this is so complex. It's almost impossible for me to begin. But let me try. One of the issues with the Jesuits in the 19th century was that, well, first of all, they were suppressed. And then they were reinstated by the Pope. And after the reinstatement, they became, advocates of, what the Pope wanted was, what's the term, Chuck, you know that? You know what I'm looking for. I'm sorry, I can't find the term I'm looking for. Ultramontanism, that's what I was looking for. And that was how the Pope managed to, in the reinstatement, the Jesuits became much more devoted to supporting and defending the Pope. And so one of the things that needs to be untangled from all of this is the relationship between the Jesuits and the papacy from the very beginning. The so-called special fourth vow that the Jesuits take as missionable by the papacy, but that became very misunderstood as basically defending everything that the Pope stood for. The Pope, as I say, this is extremely complicated, and Tyrel in his writings was very, very careful. He supported what Newman said about the dogmas, and that's why Tyrel himself said that Newman was not a modernist, and And according to Tyrel's understanding of modernism, he himself would have said he's not a modernist, but he does support the notion that while the dogmas that are defined as dogmas, the whole list of creedal statements in the creed that we recite every Sunday, those do not change. The facts, so-called facts, do not change. But Newman would argue that the way of explaining them or of talking about them, that changes because we keep using whatever the modern mind, what is available to the modern mind, the systems that of intellectual discourse change. For example, with regard to historical criticism that has been adopted by virtually everybody of intellectually alert to what is going on in the world. So the way we theologize, philosophize about the creedal statements and other supporting documents, supporting arguments, I would say that Tyrel was anything but a rationalist. Tyrel really based what he understood and thought about most deeply was the theology that's of Saint Ignatius, the prayer of Saint Ignatius, the mysticism of Saint Ignatius. He was much more interested in fact, he said that the teachers of the real teachers of the church are the saints. Tyrel says that the saints are the teachers of the church, and it's the development out of what the saints understood about God and the human relationship with God that comes into question. And of course he gets that sort of thing from not directly from Schleiermacher, but say Blondel, for example, primarily influence on Tyrel. Did I answer your question?
Yes. In part, even if my suspicion for the Jesuits, for the modern Jesuits, is not completely disappeared, but yes, you answer, and of course, not all the Jesuits are the same. Of course, I know very well, but I can assure you that it's really strikingly how the perception changed from the time of modernism, where really the Jesuits were hated by the modernists. You find everywhere, but even the same Tyrel, when you speak about their confrere, he have some harsh words, even when he was a Jesuit. So it is somehow surprising the change of, and I know of course that the 19th century was very complicated time where many things happening also in the church, and so this also led to some changes in some religious congregation, but maybe we will talk a little about later. And I want to go to Sebastian because I know that he want to say something more about Newman, and I want to before mention that Deacon Morgan has a book that is coming on November 26 from Chinese University of America Press. The book is called John Henry Newman and the Development of Doctrine, Encountering Change, Looking for Continuity. And I'm sure that the book will be very dear to everyone that is curious about this great Catholic intellectual that is Cardinal Newman. And but I know that Sebastian want to say something about him, so please go on.
Well, I just wanted to supplement really what what Deacon Stephen Morgan said about Newman. That it's to me, it's amazing that he can be framed by some people as a modernist or somebody who was a precursor to modernism. The solution that the modernists offered in the face of the kind of epistemological transformations in the Western intellect that I described a moment ago, the solution they offered was simply to naturalize the Christian religion and to naturalize the articles of faith and to naturalize the dogmas and to naturalize the sacraments and to naturalize the liturgy and all of these things. That was the solution, to accept that in some way, if religion was going to be outside of the sphere of reason, you could just bring it back into the sphere of reason by making it a category or a species of nature. And Newman's whole view of the Christian religion is perfectly antithetical to this, because Newman absolutely prioritizes the supernatural life. You just have to read the plain and parochial sermons. Every single one of his homilies is about the supernatural life, which was very unusual among Anglican clergy, by the way, to preach in that way at the time. And this is not disconnected from his view of Christianity as a fundamentally dogmatic religion. You have to remember what Thomas Aquinas actually says about the Articles of Faith. He says that the Articles of Faith are, of themselves, implausible. Right? They are not credible of themselves. So how do you actually believe the testimony of God when you're dealing with articles to which you must assent which are not themselves immediately credible? Well, the solution to this problem that Aquinas offers is the solution of grace. God, in some way, enters into the human heart. He enters into the depths of your soul, and he transforms you, coming from without, transforming you from within, in what Aquinas calls, he develops a sympathy. That's the term that's translated in the English Summa. God develops in the human subject a sympathy with him, with God, so that you can believe his testimony, right? So that you can make that act of trust or belief. So the assent to the articles of faith and the supernatural life are not two disconnected aspects of the Christian religion. These two things are completely at all times together. And the person who emphasized that at a time when, in some ways, scholastic manuals had lost sight of this fundament of the Christian life, the person who was emphasizing this was Newman. So all of the stuff, all of the effects that you see of the modernist movement, like the downplaying of the supernatural life, like the deletion of references to grace in the liturgy that I described, all of that is perfectly antithetical to the project of St. John Henry Newman. So to me, I find it baffling that people try to frame him as anything but a completely orthodox Catholic.
Thank you very much. And I want to correct myself before I say that the book by Deacon Morgan was edited by Chinese University of America, that is not existing until now, because I'm sure that sooner or later will also come if the situation will remain like this. But it's Catholic University of America Press, of course, in Washington, no, if I'm not mistaken. And also I want to mention that Sebastian Morello has a book, the Word as God's Icon, Creator and Creation in the Platonic Thought of Thomas Aquinas. And to complete, I want to ask Father Taylor about one of his books that he edited in French, Modernism, Mysticism, that he edited in 2017 with Giacomo Losito, that is an Italian scholar. What is the connection between modernism, mystic, and mysticism? This is something I think very interesting to understand.
Because modernists are perhaps most often looked upon as these highly intellectual people that are out for ecclesiastical reform, and because they are, and rightly so, connected with rationalism, the fact that they had a strong interest in spirituality sometimes gets left a bit to the margins. Less so, I think, with someone like Friedrich von Hugel, who writes the mystical element in religion, as expressed in Catherine of Genoa and her friends. And so, again, you can try to make the case that von Hugel writes on mysticism despite the fact that he's interested in modernism, or one can, as Lawrence Barman has, make the case that it's out of something, his interests in what's going on with modernism and experience and religious experience, that he does get involved in the mystical element. Tyrel, of course, again, as David mentions, contributes actually to a series on the saints, and again is rather attuned to this idea of the experience of God, and also the mystical dimensions, if you will, of that experience of God. But then one comes to others, and it's, again, interesting and I think remarkable that someone as rationalistically oriented as Loisy has a great interest in Fenelon. And again, that sort of dimension of Fenelon that's attuned to spirituality, to the relationship with God. So I think the sort of way in from modernism to spirituality is precisely because they become focused on experience. And then we go back to Deacon Morgan's, I think, very good framing of issues, and that Kant leaves a kind of legacy of reframing the relationship of subject to object. And so how do you deal with the subjectivity of human knowing? How do you deal with the subjectivity of religious experience? And that puts you on the track of the mystics and their expressions of their experiences of God, that are experiences of God, and not simply their own kind of projections of that experience. So it seemed that that particular book tried to, in a way, open up a dimension of modernism that was rather neglected. But that said, there's a chapter in that book on Albert Hutin, and Albert Hutin very much reflects the kind of approach to things that was mentioned just a moment ago in relation to modernism with regard to naturalization, because someone like Hutin carries out this sort of modernist sort of notion of naturalizing the supernatural. And so he tends to kind of psychologize mystical experience with regard to Mère Cécile at Salem.
Father, if I can interrupt you, I want to mention about Albert Hutin, that he's the author. He was a priest then. He was excommunicated, I think, in 1909, if I don't remember incorrectly. And he was also in correspondence with many of the Italian modernists like Ernesto Bonaiuti, Mario Rossi, and others. And also he was the author of a book about Americanism that I think was also condemned. And if I'm not mistaken, also in that book there is this idea of supernaturalizing the natural. So I think this is a recurring theme that then will return a few decades later with Henri de Lubac and his book that was also condemned. So do you think what I say makes sense, or maybe I'm too conservative?
I think you're spot on, and certainly Pascendi was spot on, in saying that the relationship between the supernatural and the natural was a neuralgic issue. And the modernists were, and here you have to make distinctions. Like it's not an accident that, in a sense, Blondel gets into trouble because the accusation is leveled against his philosophy, that it does not do justice to the supernatural. To the extent to which that's true or not is something that's debated among Blondel scholars. But it's not, in a way, surprising that that issue does not go away, as many of the issues of modernism doesn't go away, as development of doctrine, for example, of the nature of faith and so forth, that get carried forward. And certainly there are different resources for trying to deal with those problems in ways that modernists lacked. But nonetheless, it's a kind of ongoingly neuralgic kind of problem. And that tendency to, for example, frame development as a kind of evolutionary naturalism is not necessarily characteristic of all modernists, but it's a kind of temptation to which numbers of them do kind of fall prey to. I think, again, coming back to Newman, Newman is invoked by modernists in part because he's interested in some of the same kind of problems that exercise them: development, nature of faith. He's important to them because he's a cardinal, and if they can bring him into the fold, so to speak, that's a legitimation for their ideas. And of course, Loisy becomes a major conduit for Newman's ideas in France, as does Henri Bremont. And their framing of Newman, I think, historically has a lot to answer for why Newman is sometimes regarded as suspicion. It's not Newman as Newman, as Sebastian Morello's pointed out. It's Newman as processed through a kind of modernist filtration that people pick up on. And just as kind of minor point, in the blurb for the book, it mentions Newman's theory of development of doctrine. Modernists really are looking for a theory of development of doctrine, I think in a way, arguably, that Newman is not.
Thank you, Father. I want to go to Deacon Morgan, and I want to go back a little to Pascendi. Pascendi was the most important document probably of the whole papacy of Pius X. I think, of course, myself, I can say that it is the motu proprio on sacred music on 1903 because for me personally, of course, it's a particular importance, but I have to recognize that Pascendi was really like a bomb really on the church, and you can see also the consequences. So I want to know, what is your evaluation about this document?
Well, the first thing I want to say, by the way, is that the motu proprio on sacred music, of course, gave us that hugely controversial expression, active participation. So we can thank Pius X for introducing that to our vocabulary. What I wanted to say really about Pascendi, whilst being hugely sympathetic to what St. Pius X was trying to do, I think one of the problems that it created, as much as it attempted to solve other problems, was its very bombastic tone and its suggestion of an organized, systematized nature of modernism hampered the church actually in dealing with the realities of modernism, because modernism manifestly wasn't this kind of huge conspiracy, and it's much more a kind of portmanteau than a system, a portmanteau of connected ideas. And I think Sebastian has traced their remote origins very accurately. But to pretend that this was some kind of system that was worked out in the same way, for example, as Thomas's scholasticism, simply wasn't true. And people could see it wasn't true. And one of the things that we have to face in papal documents is that assertions of things that are demonstrably untrue, simply because they've been uttered by the successor of Peter, don't make them true. And I think for bishops who wanted to hold the line against modernism, that kind of tone, particularly coming as close as it did to the breakdown of European self-confidence that followed upon the outbreak of the First World War, was just really problematic. It pulled the rug out, actually, I think, from underneath people who wanted to respectably attack modernism, rather than simply construct this bogeyman that people should be frightened of, and that priests should have to take oaths against. So I think that's really, I have a great devotion to Pius X, but I'm afraid I think the tone of Pascendi was counterproductive.
Thank you for what you say. Indeed, I have to say, I want to add that there was a controversy that is available on the correspondence between Paul Sabatier, that was a Protestant modernist, and Mario Rossi, that was an Italian modernist that then became Protestant, exactly about the nature of modernism. Paul Sabatier say, oh no, modernism is just a kind of spirit that is on certain people, not very well organized. But especially the Italian modernists, they were trying to organize themselves, and organize themselves also with the modernists in other countries, especially in France, as a movement. So it's somehow very controversial. But in any case, I want to go to Father Schultenhofer, because I want to tell you that I bought your book, A View from Rome, on the eve of the modernist crisis, but yet I didn't receive the book. So I'm really looking forward to read your book. And I want to know what was your motivation in writing that book, and how much studying the modernism has led you to understand better the issues in contemporary church.
Well, thank you for the question. I wish I could understand. I mean, I wish I could remember exactly what my motivation was, but I think it had to do with this, that I wanted to try to enter into the mind of the anti-modernists, specifically as it dealt with, say, the condemnation of Tyrel. And what gave rise to the way that the so-called anti-modernists, the clerical ones, the coming from the Vatican on, their way of looking at reality. And so I appealed to social and cultural anthropology as a way to try to get at understanding how they thought and how they could come to their conclusions about the modernists the way they did. Because as Tyrel said, what Pius X did with Pascendi was he defined modernism and then condemned what he defined. And so Tyrel and others like him simply did not recognize themselves in the condemnation, because it's not what he condemned was not at all what Tyrel and people that he was associated with, what they were attempting to do with their discussion of what came to be known as modernism. As I mentioned before, Tyrel was anything but a rationalist, and so as Pascendi defined and then condemned Tyrel, it wasn't anything that Tyrel would not recognize himself in that. He was much more interested in what von Hugel was interested in, and that is to say, the mysticism, so far as mysticism helped develop how the church should speak about the dogmas. Does that help?
Yes, Father, thank you very much for your explanation. And I want to go to Father Taylor, and Father, I want to ask you how studying the modernism has changed your perspective to the church you are living. Because for me, I have to tell you, for me, studying modernism has given me a really larger perspective to understand the situation of the church now, maybe in a different way from you, maybe, but I'm sure that it gives me a much better idea why certain things are presented today and why certain people think in a certain way, because I can find a lot reading Buonaiuti, reading Loisy, reading all these very smart people in their own regard. So I want to understand what is your take on this.
Okay. Some years ago, Thomas Loom wrote a book called, I think it's called Liberal Catholicism, Reformed Catholicism, Modernism. And Loom's basic thesis was that you have this kind of liberal current that runs through the 19th century and beyond, and it assumes several forms along the way. And so Reformed Catholicism in Germany is one variant of this, and there's some interaction between so-called Reformed Catholics and so-called modernists. Modernism is a particular expression of that liberal kind of current. And again, it gains traction in the 1880s, and by 1914, things have kind of moved on, if you will, in the sense there's a sort of sea change in really the way people thought about the world as a result of the Great War and associated things. But the questions don't go away, and so this current continues, if you like. And David Tracy, in a book called Blessed Rage for Order, has certain models of theology. And he makes the argument there's an orthodox model, and that's reflected in both Protestants and Catholics. There's a liberal model that's associated in liberal Protestantism, of course, and then in Roman Catholic modernism. And it moves on to neo-orthodoxy. And that, of course, in Protestant circles is Karl Barth. And you would argue that the so-called Nouvelle Theologie is a kind of variant of that within Catholicism. And one of his points is that despite the name neo-orthodoxy, the sort of project of the liberal project, in a certain sense, flows through still the Nouvelle Theologie, but in a different kind of register than it did with modernism, in part because, of course, the Nouvelle Theologie is benefiting from a patristic revival. They're looking for a kind of reconnection of theology and spirituality, and the fathers kind of do something of that. They're looking for a less abstract language, getting away from scholasticism. But in a certain sense, the project is a kind of renewal scholasticism from within, a kind of a transcendental approach to scholasticism in one of its guises. And so it really sets these particular questions on a different footing. Another way to say that is somebody like Loisy in his time thinks that, okay, there's this historical consciousness that's been mentioned, this historical distance between the present and the past. And Loisy thinks, because of his epistemological commitments, that it's possible to find a kind of objective sort of methodology that's going to be able to retrieve the past in a certain kind of objectivity. That if you find the right method and if you apply it impartially, you will get to what happened in the past. And what that does is neglect, of course, the situatedness of the interpreter. And certainly, again, one of the benefits, if you will, and looking at development of doctrine through Vatican II, is kind of the rise of a hermeneutical consciousness that also has to take seriously the situatedness of the hearer and of the interpreter, not again as necessarily a distortive sort of introduction or factor into interpretation, although it can be that, but rather a kind of way of connecting with the tradition. So if you take someone like Gadamer, historical distance is not only a kind of loss because of historical distance, because of what happens in the interval of that tradition, it's also a gain. We read, for example, St. Paul through Augustine and through Aquinas and through Luther and through other people. And because of that, we have a kind of enriched understanding, at least potentially, of what's in the past. And again, if one approaches the past with a kind of openness and says that that past has a claim upon us, that tradition has a claim upon us, that subjects our own kind of prejudgments to a kind of challenge by that tradition, sometimes a confirmation, but sometimes very much a kind of modification. So I would say that the problems of modernism, many of them, don't go away, but the resources for answering them change. And therefore, some of, at least, of the ways of addressing those problems are able to do that in a way that modernists did not. And one of the things we can learn from the modernists is some of the thoroughfares not to go down. Some of the ways that approaches don't work, if you will, and some of the ways to appreciate how our own situation, if you will, gives us resources to address some of those questions in ways that modernists did not. So there's a kind of enduring significance, I think, in their questions, what they got right, what they got wrong, but yet at the same time realizing that things have moved on and we're not in the same situation that they were.
Thank you, Father. We are going to the end of the program, but I have space for two more questions. And one is for Sebastian. Sebastian, you may be very familiar with an Italian philosopher called Augusto del Noce. Augusto del Noce say a phrase that I think is quite interesting, and I want a comment from you. The phrase is, a progressive Catholic is closer to a non-Catholic progressive than to a non-progressive Catholic. What do you think? Do you think that it makes sense?
Well, this goes back to the one drum I've been beating for this entire discussion, which is that what distinguishes the Catholic from, or if you want to be broader, what distinguishes the life of the baptized from the unconverted world is supernature. That's what distinguishes those. So if from within the church, as a member of the church, you are in effect downplaying, denying, disparaging indirectly the supernatural life, then essentially you share in common with the unconverted world a single worldview, one that is that essentially denies the central vision of Catholicism, the supernatural worldview. So, and Del Noce was a very good example. I mean, particularly the later Del Noce was very good at identifying this as the primary problem. I write for a journal called the European Conservative, and we recently published something by Del Noce, which we translated into English, and he wrote it, I think, in the 80s, in which he identifies this, the question of supernature, as the fundamental the fundamental question that underpins the crisis in the church today. And of course, it might be worth noting, in support of some of the things that's been said this evening, that Del Noce was not a scholastic himself. One can understand why certain people among the modernists who felt that scholasticism, particularly late scholasticism, and Catholicism were being increasingly framed as synonymous, and why such people felt alienated from mainstream Catholic intellectual culture, because they are not synonymous terms, and while scholasticism is one of the great intellectual instruments of the church, the Greek fathers, for example, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, these were not scholastics. These were classical figures. You can understand that, but it's just one of the great tragedies of church history that this realization led people down a path that was essentially unorthodox. Yes, I think if you accept the premise that I've advanced, that the prerequisite for modernism is in some way the denial of supernature, then one can be very sympathetic to what Del Noce says.
Well, thank you. My last question is for Deacon Morgan. And Deacon, so we mentioned many times about Vatican II, and this event so important in church history. So can you tell me how and if we can connect modernism to Vatican II? What is the relationship? Because some scholar, mention about Vatican II as to be a sort of accomplishment of certain feature of modernism. So what do you think?
Oh, these are very often the same people who want to proclaim John Henry Newman as the morning star of the Second Vatican Council. It's a profoundly ahistorical thing to do, I think. Pastor Taylor put it very well a few moments ago when he talked about the fact that these questions didn't go away. Pascendi notwithstanding, people were still faced with the same question. How do you connect the subject and the object? How do you give an account of Christianity which properly takes account of the natural and the supernatural? It seems to me no accident, for example, whether one is a huge fan of that particular conciliar document or not, it seems not accidental that Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, is so influential in the writing of Gaudium et Spes. He's a man whose entire philosophical and theological project is informed by both the desire to take seriously the irreducibility of the human person, the acting subject, and the objective nature of truth. Remember, he and the other members of the Lublin school are committed to the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas, actually explicitly and virtually upon oath committed to that. So these questions don't go away. And the questions surface again. Of course, they're going to surface when you bring together 2,500 bishops of the church and their theological advisors. And you're going to get answers that are more or less consistent with the teaching of the church. Now, in previous ages, we were used to ecumenical councils using language extremely tightly it's very clear that because of the adoption of a kind of hortatory, exhortatory register, that becomes problematic at Vatican II. And it's absolutely certain that people whose interests are not those, I think, of the Catholic faith, but within the Church, were able to use some of that language and continue to be able to use some of that language in a manner that's prejudicial to it. Does that mean that the Second Vatican Council is a flowering of modernism? Well, to come to that conclusion would mean that one rejected the nature of what's actually going on in an ecumenical council. Something can't be true today that wasn't true yesterday. Something can't be both true and not true. These kinds of at least not in the order of dogmatic truth. These rules of logic, these rules of faith don't get set aside. And so we have to try and understand the Second Vatican Council according to use Benedict XVI's expression, a hermeneutic of reforming continuity of the one subject church. Quite where that takes us is a different matter. You know, part of the noise you made reference earlier, I think it was Sebastian made reference earlier to some of the mystifying remarks of the Holy Father. I think many of those remarks are mystifying simply because he uses language in much the same kind of way as some of the Second Vatican II documents. Does that mean that the Pope is a modernist? I don't think the Pope's a modernist for one moment. Does that mean that the Pope doesn't believe what the Church teaches? I don't think that for one moment. So I think it's in the same space, I think, Aurelio, as Father Kimball's treatment of Newman in the Trojan Horse book. If you want to see a conspiracy that takes you from John Henry Newman through Tyrel to the Second Vatican Council, through to some of the wilder interpretations put upon its documents, then you're going to see it. I did enough history, and like Father Schultenhofer, would probably call myself a historical theologian as much as anything else. I did enough history to know that that isn't actually how things work. If I did think they worked like that, I would wonder about the action of the Holy Ghost in the life of the Church, frankly.
Thank you, Deacon Morgan. I think that it was a very interesting program where you all contribute really important thoughts on this topic of modernism. Of course, I know that so much we can say, especially on individual characters, like Loisy or like Tyrel or Bonaiuti, Blondel, and all these other. But I think now is a sort of introduction to this topic. So I want to thank everyone for participation, Deacon Morgan, Father Schultenhofer, Dr. Morello, and Father Taylor. And I ask you to, my guest, to wait 1 minute after the end of the program so that we can greet each other in private. And for the people that is viewing, I thank you very much for your participation in this program. And I will wait you for the coming program next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.